The first reading is from the first chapter of Exodus, beginning with the 8th verse. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Rameses for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that were imposed on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, she shall live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Here ends the reading.
Our gospel reading this morning comes from Mark, 9th chapter, verses 2 through 8. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became a dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He didn't really know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." And suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. Our Lenten theme this year is Babies of the Bible. So this theme may or may not have been suggested by your resident baby fiend, but it's more than just a passion for all things infant. It's a recognition that sometimes there is truth revealed at the beginning of things, truths that can get buried by the years and the life that follows. So it can be helpful to backtrack to see if we might be able to find that seed that God planted way back then in order to better understand what is happening now. Traditionally, no one likes a prequel. Once you've invested in Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, and Harrison Ford as Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, and Han Solo, it's really hard to work up much interest in what came before them. So in our gospel reading, we have opened up with this all-star cast of Moses, Elijah, and Jesus on a mountaintop. It's a blockbuster scene. The momentum is building. So when the preacher just sort of pushes the pause button and says, "Let's go back before this story begins," it feels a little like a letdown, possibly. So, in other words, let's leave this big theater with the cushy chairs and the surround sound and the pastries, and let's go over to this little hole in the wall cinema with its uncomfortable broken down chairs, stale popcorn, and reel to reel projector. Let's watch the prequel. Woo! Before we start the projector for the prequel, let's take a second to think about what it is that makes a prequel worthwhile. When we go back and immerse ourselves in this time before, it's our chance to watch for those tiny little plot points that long ago and far away turned the narrative in the direction that we are now traveling. So when we're watching, we keep alert for those aha moments. When we discover the offhand comment, the simple decision, or, be still my heart, the brief cameo appearance of a bit player around whom the entire franchise will then shift its orbit. So for that reason, I'm going to leave Moses as he stands on the mountaintop with Jesus and Elijah. And together we are going to all go back and indulge Moses's prequel. And you will quickly discover that it is not simply the prequel to the Moses story, but to the Jesus story, to the story of our entire Christian faith, and therefore, in many ways, the prequel to life, the universe, and everything. Bonus points if you know what that comes from. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Okay, moving on. So to find the seed of this story, we travel all the way back to the first chapter of Exodus, in the years when Joseph's father and brothers had joined him in Egypt. You might remember that Joseph had been sold into slavery by his brothers. He had landed in Egypt, where he had actually made quite a name for himself. And now Joseph's father and brothers are joining him there, where the tribes of Israel settled, prospered, and multiplied. Diane did a wonderful reading of this, but I'm just going to kind of review the highlights. So Joseph and all of his brothers came back, 70 persons in all, generated by Jacob's seed, had relocated to Egypt. And then it's written that Joseph died and all of his brothers and that whole generation, but that the children of Israel kept reproducing. They were very prolific, a population explosion in their own right, and the land was just filled with them. They were everywhere. You could not turn a corner without bumping into some child progeny of Jacob's seed. Eventually, this new king comes to power in Egypt who does not know Joseph. He does not know that family, and he spoke to his people in alarm. So this is the Pharaoh now. There are way too many of these Israelites for us to handle. We've got to do something. So let's devise a plan to contain them, because if there's a war, they might join the enemies or they might just desert us. Either way, they're not going to be useful to us. And so the Egyptians organized the Hebrews into work gangs, basically, put them into slavery and put them under the observations of these gang foremen. The foremen then had them working harder and harder, trying to basically tire them out so they wouldn't reproduce anymore. But this did not work. The harder they worked, the more children they seemed to pop out. There were just Israelites everywhere. The Egyptians got so they couldn't stand these Israelites, and they treated them worse than ever. They had them making bricks and mortar without giving them the straw or the mud, but piling on the quotas, crushing them under this cruel workload. Nothing was working. So finally, the Pharaoh calls the two Hebrew midwives to come in and speak with him. And he gives them an order. When you deliver a baby to the Hebrews, look at the gender of the baby. If it's a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, you can let her live. But the midwives, they just had far too much respect for God, and they did not do what the Pharaoh had ordered, and they let the boy babies live. So the king calls them back in. Why didn't you obey my orders? You've let those babies live." And the midwives answered Pharaoh, "The Hebrew women aren't like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous. Before we can even get there, they've already had their babies." Well, God was pleased with them. People continued to increase, and the midwives also ended up with families of their own. So that's the prequel. Can you see why I love this story? Shifra and Puah. These are my Hebrew heroes. They are my favorite characters in the entire Bible. I posted this on Facebook that I would be revealing my favorite characters, and one person from a former church said, "Pick me, I know who it is," because I talk about them a lot. Shifra and Puah. They are amazing. Who are they? They are nobody. They are slave women, and they spend their time engaged in what would be considered a ritually impure role, helping with childbirth. For those of you who've not been through it or seen it, it is a messy business. The men who created rules around purity, they were pretty squeamish when it came to having anything to do with women's natural functions. So childbirth, though obviously necessary, was circumscribed by this whole list of rules and distancing. And midwives lived within those rules. So they pretty much had to keep their distance all of the time. According to the story, these two particular midwives, Shifra and Puah, they didn't even have children of their own, which was essentially the only thing of value that women were seen to offer in those days. So Shifra and Puah really were the very definition of nobody. They were nobody. And yet, these two women exercised one of the very first instances of civil disobedience in the entire Bible. These two nobodies quietly went up against the most powerful person in the known world at that time, the Pharaoh of Egypt. Two nobodies. The Pharaoh's getting nervous because he's enslaved a population that just keeps growing. And like all dictators and despots, he lives in a state of this constant sort of internal fear of being displaced. He externalizes that fear through acts of intimidation and violence. This may sound familiar to you. In this case, the Pharaoh of Egypt summons the midwives to the palace where he orders them to kill any male babies that they deliver. Shifra and Puah, what did they do? They simply fail to follow his orders. Or, as it might be reported today, nevertheless, they persisted. It is an act of passive resistance at its very best, and it gets better. When the Pharaoh calls them back before him to question them as to why they have disobeyed his direct order, they offer an explanation that a man, one who's about as far removed from the messy reality of women and the birthing process as one can get, is very hard pressed to argue with. They say, these Hebrew women, they're just so strong, they're so robust, and they are so unflappable that they just push those babies out before we can even get there. The Pharaoh, who is strong in war but weak in the stomach, sends them away before they go into any further detail. It's like, okay. So do you see what they did here? Not only did they succeed in defying the authority of the most powerful man in the kingdom, but they left him more afraid than when he first issued his orders. By putting forward this idea that the Hebrew women were of much hardier stock than the Egyptians, they plant this whole new layer of fear in his mind. Shifra and Puah, come on. As midwives, They just claim the power that is available to them within their particular circumscribed world. They claim their power, which is bringing life into the world. And they use that power to obstruct the power of the nation and its emperor to pursue its agenda of death. These women do this because they have a greater faith in the God of creation and of life than they have fear of this empire bent on destruction and death. My guess is that they do it for the very simple reason that they are midwives, not murderers. Their life's purpose is to serve mothers and babies, specifically those mothers and babies that live under oppression. There's no evidence that these women have chosen a path of righteous rebellion. Instead, they just carry on. They just carry on with their work, silently, determined, unobtrusively brave. They defy the Pharaoh by just choosing to follow their calling to be the people that they were meant to be. They overturn an empire by being women who choose life. And one of the lives they chose was that of baby Moses, who would grow up to deliver those same Israelites, so feared by Pharaoh, from his enslaving hands. And that's why I love these two, Shiphrah and Puah, my heroes. And here's why I love the Bible and the God that is revealed within its pages. I love this book because here in that tiny print, in those hundreds of pages representing thousands of years of history that make up the Bible, there in that tiny, tiny print, these two women, these two nobodies, they have names. That is astonishing. Shiphrah and Puah, two tiny, minor bit players, two slave women. They are named, and thousands of years later, they are remembered. That is the God that we serve, the God who works through the quiet, invisible, powerless nobodies to change the world. And they did. They changed the world. Without Shiphrah and Puah, Moses would never have survived. The Israelites would never have been freed. There would never have been a David, which means there would not have been a Jesus. Without Jesus, Christianity could not have been born into the world. And without Christianity, our world would have a very different history and we would be living in a very different place. That's pretty big. And it gets even bigger. Having now seen the prequel and recognized the impact of these two women who in any other script would have only been named as Midwife 1 and Midwife 2, but here they are known as Shiphrah and Puah, we come away from this fully aware that anyone we meet, anyone, could be quietly, faithfully choosing to follow God's calling in their life, silently defying the reality being imposed on them by others, and heroically changing the narrative of our world. It could be anyone. It could be one of us. It could be me. It could be you. Amen.
Amen.
Our prayer response uses traditional words from the 2nd century, the Gloria Patri.
Our sung response is Glory be to the Father.
And I leave us with these words from Saint Clare of Assisi, who birthed an order of women that are based around the precepts of St. Francis of Assisi. And she wrote, "Go forth in peace, for you have followed the good road. Go forth without fear, for he who created you has made you holy, has always protected you, and loves you as a mother. Go forth and choose life." Amen.
Amen.
So most of you who've been joining us week by week know that we take a little stretch break. You can unmute yourselves and talk to each other, and then we spend time in small groups just catching up and enjoying one another's company. So feel free to unmute, to stretch, to go get a drink, whatever you need to do. Good to see everybody.
I have to get going because I have to eat lunch and then drive back to Sackett's today. So
Safe travels,
Yeah.
Evan.
thanks. I'll see you all next week.
Bye, Abby.
Bye. Good seeing you.
Good to see everybody.
Hi, Evan.
You too, Jen. Prayers.
Thank you.
Hey, Ray.
That was fun to have the Hitchhiker's Guide and Star Wars in the sermon.
Right? I know.
Yeah,
Cultural
lots
points.
of points. Remember your towel. Hi, guys.
Well, Wendy, I'd like the citation from St. Clair, because that's my hometown, Santa Clara, California. And I didn't know that she said those things. So I wrote them down. Jesus
All
as a
right.
mother, and she wrote choose life. I mean, that's an ancient Jewish expression.
No, actually,
but-
I put the choose life on there.
Oh, okay.
I did
okay.
add that last tiny piece to St.
Okay,
Clair. You're
okay,
right.
but she referred to Jesus as a mother.
Yes, she did.
Deuteronomy.
Before we all
choose life is somewhere in Deuteronomy. I gotta look it
Yeah.
up.
Choose
Yeah.
life
Good thing to
is
remember.
biblical.
No, but it's not St. Clair that said
It is
that.
not
so,
St.
yeah.
Clair. So she
Yeah.
but she
Mhm.
did the reference to the mother is St. Clair.
Yeah.
Before we all go, I want to say, Pam, it was great to have you with us, and I invite all of us to respond to Pam's request and hold Reverend Lee Kuhn in your prayers.
Oh, yes.
We certainly will.
That's good.
When Reverend James Lehman started at Salem, I didn't know him because he was brand new, and I was a little skittish of a new person. And then he did a sermon, he referenced to Superman, and I'm like, okay, he's cool. I was in junior high, and he's talking about Superman. I'm like, all right.
Good to see you, Suzanne.
Oh, that's not what I wanted.
Bye. Thank you. Have a
Bye,
good week.
Suzanne.
Thanks for
Bye,
coming.
Suzanne.
Adio.
Bye,
Adio.
Suzanne. Thanks for reading. Mhm. Goodbye, everyone, and happy day to Peter.
Bye, Jeff.
Thanks,
Bye,
Jeff.
Happy
Good job.
birthday,
Many
Peter.
more birthdays, all healthy. Bye-bye.
Bye, Jeff.
Bye. Uh-huh.
Bye-bye. That was cute.
Good.
Wow, we're losing a lot of people.
Most people do this. They feel like they've done their bit. Now they're going to go have lunch. I like to chat with y'all before we build up my appetite just a little bit more.
I didn't know it was going to rain today. My windows are completely soaked.
So, Michael, I plan to go back and listen to the archived interview with
Me too.
Kevin Dawson. I used to listen to that all the time when I was.
Thank you, Wendy. It was
Yeah.
really, it was fun. It
I
was
like
a lot
Evan.
of
He's a
fun.
good guy.
Yep, and it was a great experience, and I'm honing my skills. I'm definitely getting. It was
Yeah.
it was a great day because I went to school that night, talked on the radio, met with a bunch of legislators in the morning.
Very stimulating, huh?
Yeah, it was a really, a fulfilled day.
Wow.
Lord
Very
knows we need them.
Yeah, one thing I don't do as much now that I'm not commuting. I don't hear those radio shows so often. That was always my commuting.
Wendy, did you accidentally hit the record button?
Just now? No. Oh, we are recording.